The Steve Harvey Show studio in Chicago was filled with anticipation on this particular Thursday afternoon in November 2023. The audience had already been warmed up, the cameras were positioned perfectly, and the stage lighting created that intimate atmosphere that made every conversation feel personal. This was the environment where real stories unfolded, where everyday people became heroes, and where Steve Harvey's gift for connection turned ordinary interviews into extraordinary moments. Steve walked onto the stage to enthusiastic applause, his tailored navy suit catching the studio lights perfectly. He waved to the audience, his signature smile radiating warmth and authenticity. As the applause died down, Steve settled into his chair with a more serious expression than usual. "Good afternoon, everybody," Steve began, his voice carrying that mixture of authority and warmth that had made him a household name. "Today I want to introduce you to someone whose story is going to challenge everything you think you know about dedication, about sacrifice, and about what it means to truly change lives." The audience quieted immediately, sensing the weight of what was coming. "This woman has been a teacher for 37 years, Steve continued. "She's taught in one of the most challenging schools in America. She's never made more than $42,000 a year, and yet she has transformed the lives of over 2,000 students in ways that will break your heart and restore your faith in humanity all at once." Steve paused, looking directly into the camera. "Please welcome to the stage Mrs. Eleanor Davies." From the wings emerged a woman in her late 60s, her silver hair neatly styled, wearing a simple but elegant purple dress. Eleanor Davies moved with the quiet dignity of someone who had spent decades commanding classrooms with nothing but presence and purpose. Her face showed the lines of someone who had smiled often and cried more than she'd ever admit. The audience applauded warmly as she took her seat across from Steve. "Mrs. Davies," Steve said, rising briefly to shake her hand before sitting back down. "Thank you for being here. I've been doing this show for years, and I've heard thousands of stories, but when my producers told me about you, I knew we needed to have this conversation." Eleanor smiled gently, her hands folded calmly in her lap. "Thank you for having me, Mr. Harvey. Though I have to say, I'm not entirely sure why my story is so special. I'm just a teacher who did her job." Steve shook his head immediately. "See, that's where you're wrong, Mrs. Davies, and by the end of this conversation, I'm going to make sure everyone in this studio and everyone watching at home understands that what you did goes way beyond just doing your job." He leaned forward slightly. "Let's start at the beginning. You've been teaching at Lincoln High School in South Baltimore for 37 years. Tell our audience about that school." Eleanor's expression grew more serious. "Lincoln High is what they call a Title I school, which means the majority of our students come from low-income families. The neighborhood around the school struggles with poverty, violence, and limited resources. Many of our students come to school dealing with trauma that most people can't imagine: homelessness, food insecurity, domestic violence, incarcerated parents." She paused, her voice steady but emotional. "For a lot of my students, school isn't just about education. It's the safest place they'll be all day. It's where they get their only hot meal. It's where someone might actually notice if they're hurting." The studio was silent, everyone absorbing the reality of what Eleanor was describing. "Mrs. Davies," Steve said gently, "you teach English and literature, but according to the letters we've received, and we've received over 300 letters about you, you do a lot more than teach books. Tell us about the notebooks." Eleanor's eyes immediately filled with tears, and she had to take a moment before speaking. This was clearly something deeply personal. "The notebooks," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "On the first day of school, every single year for 37 years, I give each student a composition notebook. Not for assignments. These notebooks are personal journals, and I tell my students the same thing every year. This notebook is yours. You can write anything in it. Your thoughts, your fears, your dreams, your anger, whatever you need to say. And if you want me to read it, you leave it on my desk. If you don't, you keep it private. But this space is yours." Steve's expression showed he understood the significance. "And they write in them?" They write everything, Eleanor said, tears now flowing freely. Over the years, students have written about abuse they were experiencing at home. They've written about contemplating suicide. They've written about their parents' addictions, about being homeless, about watching violence in their neighborhoods. They've written about dreams of going to college, even though no one in their family ever has. She wiped her eyes but continued. And every single one of those notebooks that gets left on my desk, I read. Every single one. I respond. I write back to them. Sometimes it's encouragement. Sometimes it's connecting them with resources. Sometimes it's just letting them know that someone sees them, that someone cares. The audience began applauding, but Eleanor held up her hand. Please, you need to understand something. I didn't do this for recognition. I did it because these kids needed someone to see them. In a school of 900 students, it's easy to become invisible. The notebook made sure no one stayed invisible to me. Steve leaned back in his chair, visibly moved. Mrs. Davies, how many hours a week did you spend reading and responding to these notebooks? Eleanor thought for a moment. In the beginning, maybe 5 or 6 hours a week. But as word spread over the years, more students wanted to participate. By my last few years of teaching, I was spending 20 to 25 hours a week outside of school reading and responding to student journals. 25 hours, Steve repeated, letting that sink in. That's more than half a full-time job, on top of your actual teaching job, and you weren't getting paid extra for this. No, Eleanor confirmed, but that was never the point, Mr. Harvey. The point was giving my students a lifeline when they needed one most. Steve stood up from his chair, too moved to sit still. He walked a few steps, processing what he was hearing, then turned back to Eleanor. Mrs. Davies, I want you to tell our audience about Marcus, Steve said, because Marcus is why you're here today. Eleanor's composure completely cracked. She put her face in her hands and sobbed. The audience waited respectfully, many of them crying along with her. Steve walked over and handed her a tissue, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. When Eleanor finally looked up, her face was streaked with tears, but her voice was determined. Marcus Jenkins was a student of mine 22 years ago. He was 15 years old, a sophomore, and he was angry at the world. His father was in prison, his mother was struggling with addiction, and he was essentially raising his 2 younger siblings. He was brilliant, but he was failing every class because he had given up. She continued. One day, Marcus left his notebook on my desk. What I read that day still haunts me. He had written, I don't know why I'm writing this because nobody cares anyway, but I'm tired. I'm so tired of fighting. My little brother and sister deserve better than me trying to take care of them. Maybe they'd be better off if I wasn't here anymore. I've been looking at my mum's pills and thinking maybe if I took enough, everyone's problems would be solved. The studio gasped audibly. Several audience members were openly crying now. What did you do? Steve asked softly. I didn't wait until the next day, Eleanor said. I found Marcus in the hallway that afternoon before he left school. I pulled him aside into my classroom and I told him directly, Marcus, I read your notebook. You are not going anywhere. Do you hear me? You are not leaving this world because you matter more than you know. Eleanor's voice grew stronger. I told him that I was going to help him, but he had to promise me he would hold on. He broke down crying in my classroom, and we sat there together until 6 o'clock that evening, talking about his life, his fears, and his dreams. Then I drove him home and I met his mother. I connected them with social services, with food assistance, with counseling. I became Marcus's advocate. And what happened to Marcus? Steve asked, though his expression suggested he already knew. Eleanor smiled through her tears. Marcus graduated from my class. He went to community college on a scholarship. He transferred to a 4-year university. He became a social worker specializing in at-risk youth. And for the past 22 years, Marcus has sent me a card every single year on the anniversary of the day I read that notebook. He always writes the same thing, "Thank you for seeing me when I couldn't see myself." The audience erupted in applause, many standing, moved by Marcus's transformation and Eleanor's intervention. But Steve held up his hand. Mrs. Davies, Marcus isn't the only one, is he? Tell them about the others. Eleanor shook her head. Over 37 years, I've had 16 students write about contemplating suicide in their notebooks. 16 children who were so overwhelmed by their circumstances that they couldn't see a future. Every single time I intervened, every single time I connected them with help, and all 16 of those students are alive today. The studio fell into stunned silence. All 16, Steve repeated, his voice breaking. Mrs. Davies, do you understand what you've done? You've saved 16 lives. 16 families still have their children because you cared enough to read a notebook and act. Eleanor was sobbing now, but she managed to speak. I've never thought of it that way. I just did what any teacher should do. I saw students who were hurting, and I helped them. Steve turned to address the audience. Any teacher should do this. How many teachers do you all know who spend 25 extra hours a week, unpaid, reading student journals and personally intervening in their lives? How many teachers do you know who have saved 16 lives? He turned back to Eleanor. Mrs. Davies, you retired from teaching last spring after 37 years. Why did you retire? Eleanor's expression became sad. My husband Thomas was diagnosed with ALS 3 years ago. His condition has progressed to the point where he needs full-time care. I couldn't keep teaching and take care of him the way he needs, so I retired to become his caregiver. And financially? Steve asked gently. How are you managing? Eleanor looked down at her hands. It's difficult. My pension is modest, and Thomas's medical expenses are considerable. We've had to make sacrifices, but we're managing. We have each other, and that's what matters. Steve nodded slowly, then looked directly into the camera. Here's what Mrs. Davies doesn't know. When my producers first heard about her story, they started investigating. They reached out to Lincoln High School, and what they discovered was extraordinary. He turned back to Eleanor. Mrs. Davies, your school put together a package for us. It contains letters from former students, over 300 letters. These are people you taught 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and every single one of them says the same thing, that you changed their life. Eleanor covered her mouth with her hand, overcome with emotion. But there's more, Steve continued. Those 16 students whose lives you saved, they found each other, they formed a group, and they wanted to be here today. Steve gestured toward the wings. Mrs. Davies, please welcome the 16. One by one, 16 people of various ages, from their 20s to their early 40s, walked onto the stage. Each person approached Eleanor, hugging her, crying, thanking her. The studio audience was on their feet, applauding and weeping as they witnessed this reunion. Marcus Jenkins, now a 40-year-old social worker, was among them. He was the last to approach Eleanor. When he hugged her, he whispered something in her ear that the microphones caught. You saved my life, Mrs. Davies. Now we're going to help save yours. When everyone was seated and the emotion had subsided slightly, Marcus spoke to the audience. Mrs. Davies doesn't know this, but we've been planning something for 6 months. Each of us 16, plus dozens of other former students, have been fundraising. We've also reached out to every major news outlet, every education organization, and everyone who would listen about what this woman has done. He looked at Eleanor with deep love and gratitude. Mrs. Davies, you spent 37 years investing in us. You spent your own money on supplies, your own time reading our pain, and your own emotional energy carrying our burdens. You asked for nothing in return. But today, we're returning what you gave us, not because we can ever repay you, but because you taught us that this is what love looks like. Steve stepped forward. Mrs. Davies, your former students have raised over $200,000 to help with your husband's medical care and to ensure you can live comfortably in retirement. Eleanor's hands flew to her face as she sobbed. The 16 former students surrounded her in a group embrace as the audience gave another standing ovation. But there's more, Steve said, his own voice thick with emotion. The National Education Association heard your story. They've created the Eleanor Davies Lifeline Award, an annual recognition for teachers who go above and beyond to support student mental health. You're the inaugural recipient, and it comes with a $50,000 grant. Eleanor couldn't speak. She simply wept as her former students held her. Steve continued, "And one more thing. A major publishing house has offered you a book deal. They want you to write about your 37 years of teaching, about the notebook method, and about how teachers can truly see their students. They're offering a significant advance, and all proceeds will go toward funding the notebook program in schools across the country." When Eleanor finally composed herself enough to speak, she looked at each of the 16 people surrounding her, then at Steve, then at the audience. "I became a teacher because I believed that education could change lives," she said, her voice trembling but strong. "But what I learned over 37 years is that before you can teach someone's mind, you have to reach their heart. Every single one of my students had a story, had pain, had dreams. My job wasn't just to teach them literature. It was to teach them that they mattered, that someone saw them, that their lives had value." She looked at the 16 former students. "You all thanked me, but I want to thank you. You trusted me with your pain. You let me into your darkest moments, and watching each of you survive, thrive, and become the incredible people you are today has been the greatest privilege of my life." There wasn't a dry eye in the studio. Steve Harvey, a man known for his quick wit and commanding presence, stood quietly crying as he witnessed the pure love between a teacher and the students whose lives she had saved. When the episode aired 3 weeks later, it became one of the most watched episodes in the Steve Harvey Show's history. The clip of the 16 former students surprising Eleanor was shared over 120 million times across all social media platforms. But the real impact extended far beyond views and shares. Within a month, over 5,000 teachers across America had reached out asking how to implement the notebook method in their own classrooms. School districts began providing composition notebooks as standard supplies. Mental health organizations partnered with schools to train teachers on recognizing signs of crisis in student writing. The hashtag #IWasSeen became a movement as thousands of people shared stories about teachers who had recognized their pain and intervened at critical moments. Former students found their life-changing teachers and thanked them publicly, creating a wave of recognition for educators who worked tirelessly behind the scenes. Eleanor Davies's book, The Notebooks: How 37 Years of Listening Saved Lives, became a New York Times bestseller. She donated every penny of her proceeds to establishing the Lifeline Notebook program, which has since been implemented in over 2,000 schools nationwide. Marcus Jenkins left his job as a social worker to become the program's director, dedicating his life to scaling Eleanor's method so that no student anywhere would ever feel invisible or hopeless. The 16 former students, whose lives Eleanor saved, created a non-profit organization called Teachers Who See, which provides grants to educators who demonstrate exceptional commitment to student mental health and well-being. To date, they've awarded over $3 million to teachers working in underserved communities. Today, Eleanor Davies spends her mornings caring for her husband, Thomas, who, despite his illness, tells everyone who will listen how proud he is of his wife. She spends her afternoons answering emails from teachers around the world who want guidance on how to truly see their students. And every evening, Eleanor takes out a box from her closet. In that box are over 2,000 notebooks, one from every single student who ever left theirs on her desk over 37 years. She keeps them because each one represents a life she touched, a heart she reached, and a student who trusted her enough to be seen. Steve Harvey's interview with Eleanor Davies proved that heroism doesn't always look like we expect. Sometimes it looks like a teacher staying late to read journals. Sometimes it looks like 25 unpaid hours a week listening to pain. Sometimes it looks like 3 decades of choosing to see when it would be easier to look away. Eleanor Davies didn't just teach literature for 37 years. She taught 2,000 students that their lives had meaning, that their pain mattered, and that someone was paying attention. She taught 16 students who were contemplating ending their lives that there was a reason to stay. And in doing so, she taught all of us what it truly means to change the world. One notebook, one student, one life at a time.